Much for having us here to do that. We're happy to be here. So my name is Masha, and this is Ksenia. We have a podcast called Value Tokenized, focused on tokenization and the future of financial markets, how this technology can bring value to the existing traditional financial infrastructure. And for the past over a year already, we've been gathering news of what's going on in this space every week, and we've been interviewing already dozens of representatives of traditional financial markets, investors, companies that are building the infrastructure, and regulators. We've been talking to them, and there are several trends that we just couldn't help but witness, and I think Ksenia is going to continue this.
Yeah, and I'll be very short because, for example, for traditional asset classes, we've seen a large shift in terms of tokenized real estate, tokenized venture funds, but there is also a very important trend behind, or I would say above it, and that is very important for tokenization space as well, and this is sustainability. And as one of our speakers said in one of the interviews, how sustainable impact investments are going to be called in future, only investments, because it won't be possible at all in future. So this is very important topic, and that's why I think we're very happy that we're participating in this fire chat with Yala, Tamar, and Pandwe Gibson, who are going to and I'll be moderating, by the way, not her. We actually had an argument who it will be on stage. So please, ladies, I'll ask you to join us on stage, and so that we'll proceed to this discussion.
Hello?
Yeah. Wow. I told you. All right, do we have another one? Do we have a third mic? No, we have two. Oh, you have two? Okay.
No, I think it will be easier.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you first to tell a couple of words, first UL, about your work, and then ask you, Pandwe, to tell a couple of words before we start?
Okay, absolutely. Thanks for everybody who came today, despite this windy Malta weather. Finally, I feel like I'm in Malta and not in Athens or in Cyprus. My name is Yael Tamar, and I'm the CMO and partner at Solidlock. And we are leading the trend of tokenization of real estate assets, which will make real estate much more accessible, transparent, and democratized and accessible for everybody. All investors that want access to the basic asset that will enable them to grow wealth. So the reason why we're here today with Dr. Pandwe Gibson is to discuss the space of security tokens, which is the way we generate wealth and issue digital securities using blockchain, and how this trend will, again, make almost any space like real estate or green energy or other industries able to basically develop and become much more accessible, like I said, and streamline the investment in development in these industries.
Hi, everybody. I'm Pandwe Gibson. I am originally from Earth, so I have lived all over, sort of everywhere on the planet. I'm born in Chicago, raised between Chicago and New Orleans, grew up in Ghana, in France, both north and west, so literally all over on multiple continents. And through that work experience, I saw the importance of addressing climate change and sea level rise, have done work with the UN as it relates to the SDGs, and have done work on supply chain management in terms of my time at MIT. So that led to my startup, Ecotec Visions. Ecotec is a distributive smart manufacturing for smart cities play. Smart manufacturing is a $300 billion industry, and they're known for producing plastic and packaging, which is a $700 billion industry. So you're talking about a $100 billion opportunity that most would not argue about is mostly responsible for the waste that we see around the world. And so what we want to do is take the data from that supply chain and be able to provide analytics for through the blockchain in that process. In order to have that happen, we now have 52,000 square feet of space in Miami, a new facility opening up in Chicago, and the model is to open up 102 locations throughout the Southeast and the Midwest region in the US, and then an additional 48 globally that hit specific transportation and logistics hubs and or entrepreneurial or innovation hubs, so overlapping between the two, so that we can actually start to collect the data that meets those spaces. STOs are a unique opportunity to begin to not just raise capital, but to create an open source framework to collect the data and to open it up to more investors and communities. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And before we go on to actually discuss on the benefits of tokenization for smart manufacturing, I would like to address one of the first questions to Yal. In terms of tokenized securities, what are the trends that you have seen this year, or maybe we have heard about what STOs are in this industry, what it is, for maybe 2 years, and what have we learned during this time, and what to look forward, because basically now a decade is ending, and we're on the verge of something with really new time. So what are the lessons and what we should look forward in this industry of the digital assets on the whole in the future?
So there is a big dichotomy in the industry. On the one hand, people are disappointed and are saying that the industry has not taken off. I'm not one of those people, and I'll tell you why. What we're doing right now is comparing this first year, 2019, where we've seen over $2 billion of tokenized securities, mainly in real estate, but some equity and some green energy projects. We're comparing these 2 billion to 30 billion, or no, sorry, so how much was raised in the ICOs? Around 10 billion, I would say, that was raised in the last 3 years. Now, when we look at the history of ICOs, like the first ICO was conducted in, I think, around 2013, and it was somewhere around 5 million was raised. Then in the later years, 14, 15, 16, we haven't seen much happening, and then 17 and 18, there was a huge surge of ICOs, mainly because of the increase in the price of Bitcoin, which created these Bitcoin whales and millionaires otherwise throwing money around, barely reading the white papers, basically playing the lottery, right? So we've seen this huge surge in space, which gave rise to 2 very successful ICOs. One of them was Block 1, raising $4 billion, right? And seeing raises of tens or hundreds of millions. Now, when we look at the space of the STO, it's really modest, right? We're looking at maybe 20 global projects that are really worthy talking about. Tokenized funds, mainly $500 million raised in the Gulf, mainly in the UAE and Dubai, $500 million, and around 1.5–2 billion elsewhere. So it looks fairly modest, but I'm seeing this as a success, because as opposed to the ICO market, there are a lot of hurdles in regulation. There are a lot of hurdles in lack of understanding of how to do an STO, what needs to be done, and which supplier you should use for a tokenization platform, for legal and for regulation, marketing, and so on and so forth. So I see it as a success that there actually are companies doing STOs at the moment. And what I expect to see is a rise in probably 2021, but hopefully in 2020, when we're going to see a lot more clarity for regulation, much cheaper services, and also asset owners that are not afraid to enter the space. Institutional investors putting money in will definitely help fuel the industry. So we need to provide them with all the regular tools that the real estate investors like JP Morgans of this world are familiar with, and the analysts in those institutions will be able to understand and make conclusions, right? So.
Thinking, since you mentioned ICOs, there is actually another important difference between ICO and STO projects. And this is actually the relation to real world assets and companies that are actually working on something, on building something real, because before that it was tokenization of thin air, basically. And I would really like to ask you, Pandwe, as coming from traditional sector, like this is a term like a lot of people from blockchain use. There's traditional and there's blockchain. When did you know about this technology? Like when did you discover its potential? And what actually, because there were so many use cases that could have really discouraged. What helped you, what convinced you that this is something that's really applicable and can make you scale?
Yeah, I think that in order to be able to have the supply chain data utilized and iterated on, it has to be open source, and that's the benefit of the blockchain. I think in terms of our raise and the STO and why we decided to go that direction, in the US, and definitely in one of the two major capitals, so not necessarily in California, in Silicon Valley, which is one of my homes, but definitely in New York, where it is intense regulation and you have blockchain companies moving out because of the regulations. STO has brought a bit of hope to the marketplace, that by ensuring it by a physical asset, by the equipment, that there is some interest. Also, tying it to the equity of the company has created some interest from investment pools that may not have had an interest before. I think it's opened up the market in terms of the investment side, the impact investment side in the US in particular, in ways that IEO and ICO are, to be frank, kind of bad words in certain sectors, and STO doesn't have that same stigma.
And I would also like to ask here, there is one potential advantage of tokenization of security tokens that's being widely discussed. It's the secondary market and liquidity of these assets. Is it important for your investors, and what's your outlook on this topic in general?
Yeah, so we do have a utility token application where we plan to allow our users to be able to get incentives for taking pictures of pollution and or the purchases that they make through our marketplace, and that also will provide benefit to our investors from the STO side of the investment.
And I would also like to ask the same questions to Yael. What's your perspective on this?
For the real estate world, for a long time, it hasn't changed. Nothing has changed. It's you get a mortgage, you get a house as a retail investor, and as an institutional or as a professional investor, you acquire equity in the project, and you have to wait for 4, 5, 7 years to get your money back plus interest. So it's been done like that for maybe hundreds of years. So now that we have this revolutionary tool as blockchain, which basically revolutionized the way we do transactions, that you can actually, in a decentralized manner, right, transfer ownership of your asset, like Bitcoin. So when you apply this to real estate, you basically put this industry on steroids. Number one, you're able to create much more liquid assets. So you can actually, at any point in time, sell your investments to others. Now, the liquidity is not automatic because, again, it's supply and demand. So if for industries with small market caps, even Bitcoin right now has a relatively small market cap, and that's why we see such big fluctuations when a whale liquidates their assets, creating bull runs and so on. And the opposite, right, the crashes. So the answer to liquidity is really a very big market cap. Now, even financial markets, like stocks and bonds, at certain times experience diminished liquidity. When you see the reductions in the market caps of those industries, you see diminished liquidity. So at the end of the day, in order for us to see and to have the ability to trade these assets, whether they're backed by real estate, whether they're backed by green energy projects or infrastructure projects, and so on, we need to see very significant market caps. So that's one. So there is a potential for liquidity. Now, if our clients value liquidity, and that's why they come to us, I think right at this time, that's not why projects are coming to us. They're coming to us because they see us as an access to additional world of capital, sources of capital, alternative capital. Even if these investors are accredited, so-called professional investors, who could potentially go and invest in any projects they want, the ability to invest globally right now is really limited. So for me, living in Israel, it's very hard to access and evaluate a project in the United States or in Europe or in Asia. So we're giving them an opportunity to see and side these projects, right? To have a credibility and transparency, be able to evaluate projects globally and invest in projects globally. That's number one. That's what they're looking for. And from the investor side, to have access to global pool of for the sponsor or real estate developer side, to have access to a global pool of investors, it's also something they see as a very, added benefit. Now, in terms of liquidity, as we tell them, there is a potential for liquidity in the future. If you get your foot in the door today, you're gonna be way ahead of the game when we do have liquidity. When are we gonna have it? When we have a significant market cap, when we're gonna have a lot of projects, institutionals coming in. When will institutionals come in? When we have when we have projects or funds over $100 million listed on various exchanges. That's when you're gonna see the JP Morgans and Lehman Brothers and of this world come in and invest. So, and we're working to make that happen.
Thank you so much. And my next question will be, I think, starting with you, Pandwe, about the investment side of this process. So specifically, when it applies to smart manufacturing, do you see your investors, are they the people who are investing in tokenized securities in general? Or this is just a method, a way to invest, and still it's not the main point, or it's only one advantage?
So Ecotec started in 2015. I opened it with $250,000 of my own money, a prototype space that was about 2,000 square feet. Within 6 months, we had 16 companies. So if you know the co-working market or the industry at all, that's unheard of, especially in the South and Miami. There was only one other major space that opened a few years before, and it took them 6 months before they got their first company. And I think the reason for that success was because we were focusing on the consumer product and the production and manufacturing space, whereas most spaces were offering a desk, and that just didn't match the ecosystem that we had in our environment. From there, we got our first friends and family investor, got a larger facility, a 20,000 square feet facility, and then a public match for another facility, giving us the full footprint of 52,000 square feet of space. This raise that so middle of 2018, I went to MIT, made sure that this was the right model to scale. While at MIT, I saw that there was a framework and spaces in the ecosystem that were similar, and the framework specifically out of MIT was to open 102 locations out of some research from Simon Johnson, who's the dean of MIT Business School, an economist, in the book that actually just came out in May called Jumpstarting America. So Jumpstarting America highlights these spaces and a mix of capital, as Simon or Dr. Johnson is a economist and a business person, a mix of capital frameworks to be able to develop innovation. So just as a little bit of American history lesson, after World War II, or during World War II, America was sort of losing the war because we did not have a military-industrial complex. And what facilitated innovation was FDR, the president at the time, created an innovation czar who was Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush funded innovation hubs throughout the country. So the VC move that we know now out of Silicon Valley actually started as a military complex that Vannevar Bush installed. NASA, the space agency, many of the innovations that we know of in the Midwest, Boeing and all of those companies sort of grew out of that framework that he put in place, the Manhattan Project, et cetera. there was a backlash as a result of some of that innovation that led to sort of a period of anti-intellectualism, and that capital began moving through the private sector. To go directly into your question about the investor pool, I think what he outlines in the book, and part of why we wanted to make it open to be able to take capital from multiple different ways, so public, private, philanthropic partnership. I was actually just engaging with the VC who is the only VC fund in America that has a category called sustainable consumer products. And she was commiserating to me about the fact that she had to work with her LPs in order to get them to approve her adding this category, sustainable products, to the framework, because prior to that, in the impact investment space, you had either green tech, which was focused on energy, right? Or you have, if you look at any VC fund and the structure, it doesn't account for what the market is actually saying, which is why you have investment going in a particular direction. So for me, STO and the blockchain actually provides an opening of the market, and exactly what you both illuminated earlier in terms of very soon it won't be called impact investment, and very soon you won't need these sort of designations and categories. But right now, there's not a lot of awareness about how to fund what consumers are actually looking for and asking for. And so making sure that we had our raise open and available to where the market was leading was very important to us. So we were initially gonna just do a 506c offering, just traditional, looking at accredited investors. And after spending some time and knowing that we had the blockchain application in terms of the data, and STOs opened up in terms of there being some more trust in the market as opposed to the way it was with IEOs and ICOs, it became a really interesting way to finance the model and provide proof that this real estate token and traditional cash offering could be useful.
Thank you. And actually, you touched a very important question about education, because there really is a lack of information related to the different aspects of the SEO industry. And I would like to ask you, Yael, how can we actually bridge this gap? What is actually needed to educate all the parties involved in this very complex process? So what can be done, and who should be doing this? The companies, maybe it's up to the broader public. So what's your outlook on this?
So some of this education we're doing as evangelists in the field. We're doing these events. We are issuing blogs and white papers and so on. As I said previously, I think this demand kind of brings supply, and supply doesn't really bring demand. So we could offer 1 million projects right now, and maybe they won't get invested because investors don't have trust. So at the end of the day, as I said, institutional investors are going to be really the key for bringing this or getting this industry rolling. So first of all, we have to educate them. So how do we educate them? You know, we're doing also events for their analysts. We're trying to get meetings, one-on-one with people who are responsible for new and alternative asset classes within institutional investors. And we're also working with funds. So at the moment, we're spending a lot of effort on meeting with funds, to tokenize funds. It could be a 50, 100, $200 million fund that invests in real estate, because, like I said, bigger market caps are important. Once we're there, and we have maybe 20, 30 of these large projects, large funds on exchanges trading, then we can move into really doing smaller projects and marketing to developers worldwide. Because you as a developer, as a sponsor, let's say you have an amazing asset, or you're owners and operators of a hotel and you want to retire, projects like this really could become successful and could get successful raise through blockchain, through tokenization. But we're not going to go out right now and educate, these owners, operators, or single hotels or small properties in doing an STO. In the first stage, as I see it, we're going to catalyze it with institutionals, and then the market is going to see the opportunity themselves. Once they see these assets trading like stocks, we're going to see everybody jumping on the bandwagon, right? So that's it.
And I think that actually it's also a very important point about trading like stocks, for example, when it comes to institutional and retail adoption of tokenized securities. What's your look? What comes first, the institutional or the retail interest? So what is needed to kickstart? Like we have to get interest from the masses or from the top, from the institutions. So what is the order? It's a chicken and egg problem, basically.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously retail investors are really interested in getting access to properties or to alternative investments because at the moment their access is super limited. Our only way to get involved with real estate is to buy property, and a lot of people don't have the necessary capital to buy property. However, the regulation right now is such that it prevents retail investors in getting involved. There's some limited crowdfunding opportunities for real estate that exist, and there's a lot of crowdfunding in the US, for example. But there are some limitations and disadvantages of traditional real estate crowdfunding, which involve lack of transparency, lack of reporting. You don't know what you're investing in. So there's definitely inherent dangers in that. However, we're all for this market in which just like over 50% of Americans right now are trading stocks and bonds on their apps, E-Trade and so on. We want to see the same happening with real estate assets. You'll be able to trade freely fractions of properties all over the world. Yeah, and especially millennials right now are not into buying apartments or getting mortgages. These processes are way too complicated for them, and they don't have funds, simply. It's not on their priority list to buy a house. So, however, they really are interested in maybe owning a piece of an apartment in Paris or a piece of even a warehouse or a workspace in Atlanta. So it could be very interesting. Now, that said, there are limitations on unaccredited investors in most places in the world. So right now, we're talking about institutions and accredited investors that can fuel the market, while we're working with regulators, and we have a lot of meetings with regulators all over the world to show them blockchain-based investment and how secure it is and transparent, and efficient as well for the market. What we're doing is we're taking the model for an ICO in which it's 100% accessible, yet not protecting the investors, not going together with the regulation, and we're putting it, we're combining it with a 100% regulatory compliance and investor protection. So once the regulators see that, they'll open the market up to retail investors further. They started doing that already. In the US, there is what's called Reg A+, and you can raise up to $75 million for any sort of blockchain-based security. That said, it's a very expensive process at the moment. Hopefully it will change in the future, and we'll see democratization of this market. Then I personally want to see everybody in this room and anywhere in the world be able to buy tokenized securities because that's a way to build wealth. Everybody deserves for their dreams to come true and to create a good life, and they can do that, I believe, with tokenized securities.
Thank you. It really sounds like a forecast for the future, what we're hoping to see. And since our time is coming up to the end, I would also like to ask you, Pandva, maybe you can share your look for the upcoming year or two or the entire decade, because we're on the verge of it. So what should we expect? So what do you think will happen?
So I'm originally from New Orleans, and I started this work as a result of Hurricane Katrina. So my whole life was shaped by Hurricane Katrina. I watched 90% of the city be washed away. My family, in particular, the home that I grew up in, and people didn't just lose their homes, they also lost their citizenship. If you were watching the news, you saw Americans on rooftops being called refugees because of the just enormous difference in terms of people's class and the role that poverty plays in how you're seen in a country in the moment of a disaster. And so for me, given what's happening now, coming here from Miami and from California, which was on fire when I was leaving, sustainability and addressing the SDGs, the 17 goals of the UN, it's critical. So if you look at the reports or listen to what I would say most Gen Z is screaming about right now, right? The number one thing that's concerning them is, you know, what's going to happen to the planet, because according to the UN, particularly the places that I'm coming from, so not globally, but definitely some of the places that I'm coming from are not projected to be here in the next decade. So it gives 12 years. Miami in particular, which becomes interesting, a lot of people are like, what do you mean it won't be here? So New Orleans being a perfect example. The area where I'm from in New Orleans, out east, has never been rebuilt. So Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. It is no longer an area that's inhabitable because insurance companies refuse to insure that area because it's too high of a risk in terms of where it is in terms of sea level. So when people think about climate change, they're also not thinking in the US because of FEMA. If there's a storm in New Orleans, a hurricane in Florida, a fire in California, and a tornado in Montana, FEMA is only equipped to handle maybe one of those in a year, maybe two. FEMA's still repaying from Irma from 2 years ago and 3 years ago. So it's just not equipped to, once insurance companies fails, for the federal government to jump in and fill in the gap. So with that said, my prediction is that there's going to be an increase of these projects that are considered impact project or green projects. In my facility now, we have 26 companies in the space. We also launched a virtual community in August of this year. We already have 67 companies just through organic growth in the virtual community that have access to utilizing the facilities and the equipment. And so my prediction is that as there are facilities coming online and resources for people to really go after these industries, like it's already been proven that solar and these technologies are cheaper than what we are currently using, but the ability to roll them out onto the market is not there just yet, right? It's already been proving that customers want to buy products that are more sustainable or have packaging that's more sustainable or produce products that are more sustainable, but definitely in the US, and I would also say in Europe, after coming from the Waste Management Conference in Lithuania, or last year presenting at the conference in Frankfurt, Germany around plastics and packaging, this is still a global issue. Canada just agreed to continue and do deeper drilling because they can't figure out how to bring on more renewable products. So for me, I always sort of lead with this anecdote about like, why do we still have whales on the earth, right? So the US mostly was responsible for, in the early 1800s, or late 1800s, fishing whales to extinction. We were taking after Europe. You all were using gas lanterns to light your homes, and as we were growing out the new world, we were just taking that same innovation and running with it until there was a laboratory space, right? And in that laboratory space, Thomas Edison developed the incandescent light bulb. And then his assistant developed the filament that made the light bulb not explode after 30 seconds. And so the two of them then partnered with a corporation, right, GE, that agreed to roll out the grid so that we could come in with a whole new system. It wasn't activism that saved the whales. There were activists, but it didn't really matter. It definitely wasn't education. In fact, America created the book Moby Dick to make it okay for us to annihilate all whales, right? We actually still read it in schools about how horrible of creature they are, except we know that they're one of the most sophisticated and educated on the planet, right? So it definitely wasn't education that saved the whales. It wasn't politics, because politicians were being paid by the whaling industry, right? The utility at the time, the power at the time to continue the system as it was. It was innovation, right? It was innovation and business tools, right? A financial tool, a financial model that made it accessible to roll out innovation across America as the new world and then across the globe. And so my prediction is that as entrepreneurs, innovators gain access to tools to innovate, like facilities like ours, right, that allow them to have the actual tools to innovate, and then financial models that allow for, of course, major organizations to sort of adopt and come on board, but also for the crowdsourcing and the framework for more people, like Yael was saying, to actually engage in funding projects that matter to them. My prediction is that we're not going to be looking to government or education or activism to solve all these problems, but that they'll be solved as simply as, like, I fundamentally think that these communities can be viable and that we can sort of retard CO2, which we need to get it down to 1 point stable and then reduce 1.5% by 2035. And I believe that by 2025, by the 150 locations that we have, and the supply chain framework of feeding the data back into the system and optimizing supply chains and what we can learn from that, that we can actually reach the 1.5% reduction in CO2 and have, you know, multi-billion-dollar disruptive companies that have some place to go live and shop because the planet is still here and not on fire. And so for me, that's the projection. I'm from a place that's literally not projected to be here, that gets hit with major storms, Category 5, Category 6 every year. Like I said, California, when I was leaving, was on fire, literally. And so for those things to not occur as frequently, right? We're talking about storms that used to happen once a century that are now happening, you know, once or twice a decade. The reduction on those things, I think innovation is the answer. And I think the blockchain really does create a open framework for people to take advantage of that. And I think the trust that STOs provides in terms of collateralizing with real property is gonna increase adoption. Slowly, but it will.
Thank you so much for such a passion. I think it's perfect to sum up what we have been discussing today. And I would like to ask, are there any questions from the audience to our speakers?
Yeah, thank you for this exciting talk. And what I'm asking is, how do you see the incentives to bring this technology also to far communities, for example, like outside of the developed world? I mean, they don't have the necessary funds even to start and to invest in real estate, but we want to bring them in and to make it accessible. So how do you envision, shall we do it from your own activities there? And maybe you can answer as well.
Yeah, so Ecotec is a space for entrepreneurs. So you're talking entrepreneurs at multiple levels, some early stage, but some with a couple $1 million monthly revenue. So they come in at various levels in 26 companies and then 67 in the virtual community. Their workforce and their build out are in communities that are in opportunity zones, which are low income areas typically in the US. And so creating a pipeline for communities that don't necessarily have access or even understanding to this, and the unbanked population is a big part of even our location selection for the model. And the research out of MIT says that it sort of has to be done that way in order to facilitate sort of the mass adoption that everybody wants. I don't know, and I would be interested in hearing what Yael has to say, if the framework of STO, which is a funding mechanism, is necessarily the tool to facilitate adoption. I think the utility token side of things actually helps to drive adoption because you're incentivizing the population to take action in some way, and our marketplace is doing that in terms of the incentivizing framework. But I don't necessarily think the STO framework is going to, not in the beginning at least. I think over time there's an opportunity for that. But as we are right now, I do think it's more building out the framework so you get projects that are at the 20 million, 40 million, $100 million range so that you then get some of those bigger firms to come and buy in. It's unfortunate because early adopters get all the wealth, right? But early adopters tend to be, and even for ours, it's only for accredited investors, which means that you've got to have, you know, $250,000 annually to even engage in a conversation. And I would say the majority of projects are framed like that. I think the utility side is definitely more geared towards facilitating the adoption, but I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you, Pandwe, on the utility side. And traditionally, utility tokens are much more associated with incentives, incentivizing investors and creating incentive structures. And in that case, you know, that's actually one place where I really believe utility tokens' right to exist is, as in green energy and incentives, loyalty programs, right? So that said, I thought about a lot of different incentive programs with security tokens, and I'll give you an example. Let's say a city wants to build a new stadium or a homeless shelter or a youth center, right? So they can give a call to a public at wide and say, you can invest in your own city. You can invest in building something new. You can get a security token, and you can benefit from the development and the advancement of this asset. So when people own their own city or assets in their place, they take care of it much more. And if people own their city or parks or whatever, you don't have this social externality that we study about in economics. When you don't own it, you can trash it or you don't care about it. You care much more about the place where you live and a place where you know the people, right? A lot of scientists and economists are working on in this space, like for example, Dan Ariely, talking about people care about people, especially people they know, when they feel they belong and they're part of something. So I think security tokens or digital securities can give this to owners, right? So that's one way. Another way is because assets can come together kind of into funds and under different umbrellas, you may actually create a space where smaller projects will get funded, right? So we're seeing right now in the news, usually $100 million funds get funded because these people have access to money. Now, within ICO space, why it was amazing is that projects, could write a white paper and get people excited. The ICO space got people excited, right? They started talking about it. You heard about a green energy project. Wow, I want to be a part of this. So they felt a part of something. They felt a part of a revolution. You don't have that in the STO space right now. But, let's hope that we'll bring some enthusiasm from the ICO space in this space. And that's also another way, to incentivize, you get to know the community. You get to be a part of something, you get it. You can incentivize people to bring friends to also be a part of it and buy security tokens, right? Another thing is, of course, green energy projects, right? If we are selling people wind or solar farms, you can, and we can actually not only sell them the land or the infrastructure, we can obviously sell them and we can sell them the tokenized savings, carbon credits. Asaf is from Greenium. That's something that they do. So I think that we can incentivize people and to, let's say, reduce their carbon footprint and so on and so forth. Also with security tokens, because they're owning, companies that do that. So, yeah. Anybody else? Questions? There you go. Just a sec.
How is the regulation about it? Because I know about a year ago I was still following on that a bit, and the regulation was not at all yet completely how the trading will be in the STOs. If I understand that correctly, how Malta specifically is more advanced, but how is the rest going about it? Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'll start. Yeah. Well, the regulation in many places is pretty straightforward. It's complex, but actually this time around, as opposed to an ICO, they're forthcoming. The regulators are forthcoming with what you need to do. And the process is very simple. You need to issue a security. So you're securitizing, first of all. So you choose an entity you securitize. If it's a real estate asset, you securitize a company that owns a real estate asset. If it's a green energy infrastructure, you securitize a company that owns that. You can technically securitize even an equity, a company, right? A general company. Now, the regulator requires you to, number one, have a traditional PPM, a private placement memorandum, in which you announce to investors what you are selling, and number two, you need to obviously apply for whatever license in whichever jurisdiction you want to raise money. If you want to raise in the US, you usually apply for Reg D, 506B or C. That's exceptions to a prospectus requirement. So you don't have to do a full prospectus. You're not going public. You are doing a private placement. So in the US, you're doing that, applying for that regulation. In Europe, there are similar exemptions. There are a few of them, and you have to comply with each. So you have to apply for regulatory compliance in your jurisdiction with it's an expensive process, unfortunately, right now, but it's doable. I don't know if it's going to change very much because we still have to protect investors. I think there are going to be legal platforms in which you can do it much cheaper. So if right now it costs you around $30,000, $40,000 to write this legal document, you'll have platforms where you're going to be able probably just to print it out.
But I just wanted to add to that, because I think what I'm finding in talking to investors who understood and were sort of burned by the ICO space is that there's interest in the STO space because the regulations are so stringent. So I think the STO space actually provides more security for the investor, which is why you have even traditional investors and traditional funds being willing to look at it, because like we've sort of talked, the ICO space was kind of like the wild, wild west, and like, do you believe in my vision? Whereas STO is really like companies who have some proof of concept, companies who have some revenue, companies that are backing their product by physical assets, which is, you just didn't have that before in the blockchain space. It really is connecting the digital world to the physical world in a way that I think is exciting and new. And I think that's also why adoption is a little slow. Because people are still, those worlds used to be very separate, and so people are still trying to figure out how to merge them.
Thank you. Anyone else? I know Dennis must have a question. No, I haven't. No?
It means he knows everything.
So if then investors managed to accredited investors, that is, yeah? We're only talking about accredited investors. So if they manage then to acquire a few of these tokens, can they then go ahead and sell them on some decentralized exchange, or how does it work?
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. So before, when I answered your question over there, what's your name?
It's the same question. My name is Dan the Man.
All right, Dan's question. So we answered more from the issuance side, which is the primary market. So you moved it into the secondary market space. Now, that type of regulation is even more complex and right now in the works. However, at the moment, the rule of thumb is that whatever applied in the primary issuance applies in the secondary market as well, which means that if you, as accredited investor, complied with the rules, of the offering, and it's only for accredited investors, you can sell it only to investors that also comply with the rules. And the rules are KYC, know your customer, AML, anti-money laundering. You have to pass those, and you have to pass the accreditation check. In some countries, it's your accountant ensures that you are what's called a professional accredited investors. In some places, self-accredited. But if you want to sell your investment, what do? You always have a possibility to sell over the counter. So from a platform like Solidblock, we're providing you with a way to log in and offer your investment to other investors in the system, or your neighbor. If your neighbor passes all the criteria, is KYC, AML, and accreditation, you can sell to your neighbor. Now, going further, there are already exchanges that supposedly have or allegedly have all the licensing and the compliance to trade security tokens. Even if they have that, they're cautious because they need to make sure that they comply with all the rules. Now, there are a few that already are doing this, and like T0 and Open Finance, and in the US and in Europe and Asia, we have DigiFinex, and also Malta Stock Exchange and Gibraltar are saying that they have the necessary compliance. Okay, let's suppose that we can list your tokens on one of these exchanges. What's going to happen tomorrow? Are you going to see a big influx of investors coming in and buying them up? Not so sure. So, like I said, we need to make sure that there is liquidity and that there are people who are actually going to go and buying. There's also one more thing. If you issue your tokens in the US, there's a lockup of a year. So you cannot trade, if you're doing Reg D 506C, you cannot trade the tokens for about a year. So that's why I'm saying we're going to see in 2021 a big surge, because the projects that are happening now for US-based funds are going to open up in 2021. You have something to add? No? Or, awesome. There you go. Pass the mic, please.
Thank you. So I'm Vladimir. Basically, two questions. First question is about the brokers, right? So, I mean, if you're talking about the liquidity in the institutional markets, basically the brokers are the one who are making the orders on the exchange, making the trading and these kind of stuff. So, to actually have the liquid secondary market, you need to have basically traders, and to have these traders you need to convince brokers to have the connection to your exchange. You have this API and these kind. So the question is how to attract these brokers, and are there any exchanges who actually have these brokers? And the second question is more like professional, I don't know, from the training. If you know, what about the clearing? So I'm talking about regulation that these exchanges that say that they trade the security tokens, right? But how do they make the shareholder register of the company changing, basically? Because if you're doing the tokenization, you still have two words. You still have shares and you still have tokens. So you need to change the registry of the shareholders if it's more than 20%, for example, 5% of this kind of stuff. You need to have reporting, you need to have due diligence, you need to have these audit statements and taxes and so on. So I mean, there are a lot of issues, and I mean, I'm in the industry for years, and what I see like every year in these conferences, people are telling the same story, and no progress has been made, as it seems to me. Or maybe there is some more technical conferences where people are actually sharing these thoughts. Thank you.
So I guess I can address that. Actually, those are really, really good questions. I'm going to try to remember them all. Okay, so the first one I think you answered for yourself, because you said, you know, you need these traditional brokers. What do they need? And they do need easy access to all the traditional reports that they expect to have. They need API connection to the exchange, which exchanges right now are probably not providing. So Solidblock is actually working on providing whatever the institutional investors will need if should they want to have access to our over-the-counter desk. But in terms of exchanges, they definitely will need to make all the traditional trading tools available, including making indexes, making benchmarks, maybe even creating derivatives, and analytical tools that on the level of Bloomberg. So all of that, so it's surprising, but there are a few companies out there in this space that are recognizing this, and also algo companies and so on, market makers and of the world are working on creating tools for this space. So that's good news, because we definitely need that. In terms of real estate or any other assets being traded as security tokens, the way it works, the way it really works is when you create a blockchain ledger for ownership of a stock, ownership, or we could also issue debt-based security tokens. But the bottom line is that when a trade happens, you have an internal ledger, right? And it can be public if it's done on Ethereum, so you can actually go and search for Aspen coin online, go on Etherscan, and you'll see all of the investors that invested in the St. Regis, Colorado project last year, which we facilitated as Solidblock, raising $18 million. So you see how many tokens each person owns in that project, how much they invested. Obviously, it's, you don't see the details, right? It's anonymous wallets, right? You can see everybody's wallet. So that's how it works. Now, if a trade happens, you see another wallet owning security tokens. Now, what happens when that hotel is sold, right, to a third party? Like, what will happen to my tokens, and so on? You know, it really depends on the smart contract. And if the smart contract facilitates that you're getting the profit from the sale of the business, then you're going to get your pro rata profit from the sale of the business. So, you know, an investor, when they invest in a security token, definitely need to read the PPM, and they definitely need to understand what they're getting in each scenario. So that's as far as the trade. You don't need to notify your local real estate registry of any internal changes in the ownership structure. In terms of taxation, it really is complex, and most of the platforms like Solidblock provide tools for, let's say, a number of countries. Let's say you're from the US and you're investing in a project in Germany. We will, you know, provide with some basic provisions for taxation. For example, you know, we'll tell you if it's a good investment for your specific jurisdiction, or not, because, but otherwise we're telling investors to go and get their own tax advice. You're going to be usually taxed on capital gains, because, you know, a security token is an asset. So you're going to, whenever you get your dividends or whenever you get your payout from the sale of the asset, you usually are going to be taxed capital gains. So, so there's definitely, it's not, you know, it's complex, but it's not ambiguous. You have legal tools, you have taxation, you have, you know, regulation that's very straightforward. So if you have any questions, you know, any specific detailed questions, just, you know, give me a shout. I'll be happy to assist.
Again, I think part of the benefit of the STO framework that just did not exist with the ICO is that you had exchanges setting the rules, and really it being about the relationship you had with the exchange, about what regulations and what framework specifically for the startup as it relates to KYC process, for the investor as it relates to the funding. It is definitely not the same for STOs. Like Yael said, you had market makers who are actually creating a framework for the investors and the entrepreneurs on either side in terms of how their funds are being processed in the system. That just did not, it didn't exist before. And so I think the regulations are intense, but I think that it's useful, and they're no different than if you were trading in traditional securities and you needed to go through a process to onboard with Fidelity or any other large group to be able to do investments on the stock exchange.
I just want to ask, maybe it's a good remark to wrap up the conversation. So we just heard that the Libra project is being delayed, and maybe you can give your projection how it relates to STOs in general, stable coins, and in general, why it was delayed from your opinion, and how it's impacted the projects, especially in the US.
I don't know that it's related to STOs, but I think that part of why it was delayed is that you have millennials, Gen X, Gen Z saying what they want, and a sort of loss of trust in the traditional corporations, so Facebook, but really all of them. I think with my generation and the generations behind me, there is a intense loss of trust, and so you're going to see a desire for adoption in new platforms and in new innovation, because you just haven't seen that before. And I also think that it's a great opportunity for startups. I mean, just in general, large companies can't turn on their head. So take that same example of the Whalers versus GE coming and sweeping, right? The Whalers could have innovated and funded the new innovation and just pivoted, but we already know that that's not what happens in the market. Like Ford already had lithium battery technology. All of the companies in Germany just said that they're gonna switch every car, I think it's by 2035, to electric, right? You don't have that happening with some of the bigger companies in the US, which is why you can have Tesla come in, lead, leapfrog, open source their technology, and still not have adoption happen in the industry amongst major American and Asian companies, because it's hard for juggernauts to turn. I think Libra is an example of that. Like, they're trying to remain cutting edge, but I don't think that they see the interest and adoption at the level that they expected at this point. And I think that it's going to create opportunity for startups and new ideas to sort of leapfrog in the same way we've seen historically.
So I was very hopeful about Libra, and I didn't see it as negatively as many others did. You know, there's obviously this opinion that a huge corporation that knows a lot about you, you know, also controls your money. I don't think Facebook necessarily had the plan to have people hold their wealth in Libra, right? I think their plan was to give the unbanked opportunity to transact. You know, you have money like cash right now, which is a means of transaction, but you're not storing your wealth in cash. You know, who here has $100,000 lying around in their bank account? You know, you just have money for contingencies in cash. So I think that's what Libra was about. Now, because there's a lot of concern about corporations creating their own currency, which weakens the US dollar, which is already down in the dumps, right? So there is definitely inherent fear for the government and the authorities to allow for this to happen. So they're trying to discourage Facebook, you know, even though they were wanting to do this in Switzerland. They're still an American company. They still have to comply with US regulations, and regulators are looking for ways to discredit and to take this possibility away from them. Now, I think what they're eventually gonna do, you know, what they're gonna do when Amazon and Google and all the corporations wanna create their own money to transact, you know, eventually we're gonna give in. I think, you know, they cannot contain huge corporations that are actually paying lots of taxes and, you know, lobbyists and so on. So the bottom line, why did this happen? I think they're afraid of what the backlash. They want to proceed cautiously. Where it's going to put stable coins, maybe they're going to be born out of Asia, and Alibaba is going to create the next Libra, which is going to be much more, no. China is becoming really open. So I think actually I forgot to mention for the forecast for the 2020, I think China. That's the forecast. We're going to see very, very strong China with their own powered cryptocurrencies and Alibaba coin and whatnot. So so bottom line, I think, you know, Libra doesn't mean much for us. It just means that things are going to move away from the U.S. Stable coins are here to stay, and, you know, the STOs is the future. I mean, that's what we're here for. Yeah. Another small last one.
Because I missed the first part, so maybe you covered it, but two questions. In terms of real estate, where do you focus in terms of segmentation? What projects, what real estate projects you focus on in tokenizing? Land development, land banks, construction, commercial, residential, what is the caliber? Because you mentioned one-off projects not so interesting for you. You're looking to focus on institutional part. That's the first question. And second part, a retail investor. As far as I know, there are 2 or 3 approved Reg A plus in the US, no more.
Yeah.
Have you done any pure crowdfunding projects, and in which jurisdictions?
So it's not that the small projects are not interesting for us. The small projects are less interesting to investors, right? For us, we're interested in any project. Yes. Okay, so we think that the most appropriate projects for tokenization right now are yielding commercial real estate assets. So that's number one. I think they have the biggest chance to get funding because you give a lot of security to investors in a way, especially, people are talking about the impending crisis all over the world. You have an asset that's functioning, you have an asset that's yielding, you can see the yield, you want to improve something, you want to renovate or you want to expand, you want to maybe add TI if you're doing a workspace, for example, or, So I know that there are several, even within the commercial asset class, there are several classes that are predicted to do better, and actually workspaces are some, storage facilities are others, But at the end of the day, if it's a great real estate project that will give people yield in a market that's supposed to grow, I think it's going to get much better results. So we're working on several projects, in the traditional markets in the U.S. and in Europe, some in the UAE as well, and we are actually looking into opportunities in Asia. We have a lot of demand for projects in Asia, but we have yet to see demand for investors in that region. So that's one. In terms of crowdfunding, we've looked into it. And I think that we're actually going to do a crowdfunding project in Israel very soon. We're partnering with a major crowdfunding platform there. However, there are limitations to crowdfunding. In Europe, for example, you can only raise up to $5,000 from a single investor in crowdfunding, which means that you have to spend a lot of money on marketing because you have to get a lot of investors. And you can raise up to 5 or 8 million euros, which actually could be good and enough. Yeah. Better than the US, where you can only raise $1.06 million. So we've looked into it. Our legal team advised us to start with a accredited investor approach in Europe, even though I'm really passionate about crowdfunding and allowing just general investors to jump in. So as soon as we have the right opportunity, I think we're gonna go for it within this year. I think 2020 we're gonna do a few crowdfunding projects, and we're definitely looking for opportunities to do a Reg A+. It's in the US. The reason why there are only 2 or 3 is just because it just barely started. I think we're going to see a lot more. So the way we structure and we create a strategy for investment to start with one regulation, one jurisdiction, start getting funding rolling, and then continue into other jurisdictions and other regulations. So you can actually start for accredited investors in Europe, you can move into accredited investors in the US, you can start crowdfunding, and you can apply for Reg A+. So, we build in there your capital stack in the way that's, coincides with like favorable investment strategy. So that's the approach for now. All right.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure that we thanked our sponsor, so Beatrice and Chiliz having us here. So we definitely wanted to say thank you to you and make sure that everybody knew that we got the support from you, because it was awesome, everything that we did overseas. I guess 3 different time zones in 3 different countries to pull this together. And then if people took pictures, I think all of us are presenting at the summit over the course of the next couple of days, so you can find us through the app there, and please tag us if you took pictures based off our tags being on the summit website.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much.